did a show on called Logical Insanity about the whole idea of strategic bombing leading up to the atomic bombings, and a lot of people don't put the two together. But all the atomic bombing was an extension of what was already being done, because cities were being leveled with regularity without atomic weapons, right? It just all of a sudden you could do with one bomb what it took you fleets of bombers to do. And people will turn around and go, well, how could you drop a bomb like that on civilians? You want to say, well, everybody was dropping a bomb on civilians. And before the war, everybody thought that was bad. And then once the war started, well, it's total war. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's trying to figure out how you win these wars, but they don't have any data to know. There was a whole line of thinking that this was actually a more merciful way to conduct warfare if it ended the war earlier, because the real tragedy was I think there was a statistic, and I'm going from memory, so let's just pretend it's right, but it's something like that every single day in the Far East, 10,000 innocent civilians were dying. Well, that means that every day the war goes on, that's 10,000 more. So if you do something horrific that kills 100,000 people today, well, that's 10 days worth of what was already going on. But without that, I mean, and that's why it was called logical insanity, because it's an absolutely crazy discussion to try to talk about, right? The weighing that you're doing there is between horrificness and complete immorality, and you can't square that circle unless you're in those time periods. And in the Logical Insanity show, or it might have been the
Destroyer of Worlds.
yeah, the Destroyer of Worlds, it might have been. There was a conversation in one of the books where they were talking about the Manhattan Project program and how much it had cost the American government and the public. And there was a guy named Graves who was the military leader in charge of this. And they said, had they not used this weapon once it was developed, Harry Truman and this Graves person would have been hung by the American public from the nearest lamppost, because the attitude would have been, you're telling me my son has to die maybe in the continuation of this war when you have something that we spent a fortune on, that we invented, that will end this war sooner. I mean, in other words, today we look at it as this monstrosity that's indefensible. If you go back to 1945, it was just as indefensible to not use it. And it's the context which completely changes the moral equation in that discussion. And that's why when you go to the Celestial Court of Historical Justice, I keep wondering who makes up the jury.
Right.
If you're doing the atomic bomb dropping, do we have the jury made up of today, our people, or do we put 1945 Allied, civilians on that jury? And I think if you do, you get a completely different verdict.
I think that was in Destroyer of Worlds. I was profoundly affected by that. I was teaching that stuff at that time, and I mean I can remember explicitly. I was on my treadmill in my shed listening to that, because what hit home to me so much is the way that you delved into Truman's head at the time, right? To have to make that kind of decision. Because, as people probably know, I mean, he wasn't part of the Manhattan Project. I mean, he got given a very, as Jon Stewart on The Daily Show used to say, polish that turd. I mean, he was like, in the worst situation, and then have to be the guy charting into that unknown territory and having to weigh those things. It was just brilliant, Dan. It was just brilliant.
Well, it's not that. but the context again, right? What a lot of people don't know. So what a lot of people don't know is the fire bombings that were going on, right? And so what I always tell people who say that these atomic bombings were immoral, I say, well, they were firebombing all these cities beforehand. And actually the greatest death toll in the war from bombing was the Tokyo firebombing. Right. In 1945, that was not an atomic blast, right? Killed more people than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And after the atomic bombs were dropped, they conducted several more firebombing raids. So if you don't drop the atomic bombs, you're still going to have the firebombing, which if you're on the ground, I see no functional difference between the two. Right. So and that's why Logical Insanity went all the way backwards and tried to get to how a bunch of theoretically moral people could have devised a policy that ended up doing this. right? So you go back to the air theorists of the very early. I mean, it's practically right after the Wright brothers. These guys are trying to figure out how you would use an aircraft in war. And when you read it, it sounds like these are complete humanitarians because their entire idea is you're going to do some terrible thing with this aircraft on the first day of the war, and the war will be over the next day. And hence you have saved all the lives a multi-year war would have cost. So it becomes this entire endeavor where all these people who are actually in charge of creating these bombing doctrines are themselves telling themselves when they go home at night, go to church the next day, consider themselves moral human beings. They're justifying this by saying, I'm shortening the war, and thereby I'm saving lives. And so no matter how, and in a funny way, that means the more horrific you make it in the short term, the more noble you're actually being in the long. It's the most completely twisted, but that's what context can do to you sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I always tell my students, like,
That's Jungian and Freudian too, maybe
yeah,
in its own
right,
way.
right. But I mean,
But
bar none, with the study of history, I mean, the content is great and it's interesting. But for me, it's like, students, if you learn nothing more than this one thing by the time you get finished with me, and that is historical context matters.
context. Well, and it's the real reason for, so when people say, what does history matter? You get this question. I know you guys get this. It's the number one question we get. Why should people even learn history? And what I always say is because of the context. And the way I always explain it is I always say it's like your favorite TV show, right? If you join in season 5, you have no idea what's going on, right? You don't know why this person's mad at this person. You don't know the history. They keep referring to this other character that's not around. And the only way to figure out what's going on currently in the series is to go back and watch the old episodes because it provides the context. And that's exactly what history does. It helps you understand the now because you go watch the earlier episodes.